What you're seeing right now is a street from four different games in the Yakuza franchise. The catch? The city this street is from has appeared in nearly all of the Yakuza games from its very first entry back in 2005 to even its latest entry in 2024. As I was playing one of the newer entries in the franchise, it really got me thinking about storytelling through a game setting and what keeping or changing the setting does for the franchise. I think this is an especially important topic to take a look at because, whether we are aware of it or not, the setting makes up so much of the groundwork for how we enjoy these single-player RPG franchises. And so showing us new and exciting locations or returning to familiar ones does play a big role in our overall experience with the games. To do this, I want to really dig deep into the reasons games would keep or even change their settings between games. There's definitely a lot of reasons, but I want to primarily focus on these three reasons: the game design and innovation aspect, the narrative aspect, and finally, the aspect that affects the player experience and perception of the overall franchise. In recent years, AAA RPG games made by major publishers have seen budgets reaching into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Cyberpunk 2077, for example, had an approximate budget of $316 million dollars for its original release and another $125 million dollars for its 2.0 content update and Phantom Liberty DLC. Spider-Man 2, which came out just last year, had a total budget of $350 million dollars as well. The point I'm trying to make with this is, each new expansive RPG game that hits the market is incredibly expensive, and when you add on the fact that so much of these budgets go towards marketing through hiring A-list celebrities or putting their ads all over major tourist spots like Times Square, a big consideration when it comes to iterating across a game franchise is making meaningful changes within the constraints of a bottleneck. When it comes to constructing a completely new region for a game, there's just a lot of manpower and resources that have to go into it. In an interview with Toshihiro Nagoshi, director of the Yakuza franchise, he mentioned that part of their design philosophy with choosing cities to set their games in is about leveraging their understanding of certain cities to then create a familiar and authentic representation of those cities in their games. What this then means is that a lot of time and manpower is dedicated to visiting, researching, and scaling the blueprints of the buildings and structures in these real-life cities into something that they can fit into their games. After the foundation of these cities have been created, there has to be a lot of additional work done towards how the NPCs behave in the cities, what path they travel on, and how the objects in the environment behave as well. For example, as I said before, much of the Yakuza series is set in the city of Kamurocho, but occasionally they bring their story to other fictional cities like Sotenbori and Ijincho. One of the key differences between Kamurocho and these cities is that they have completely new objects like rivers and the ferry. As we can see from this clip, the ferry has to travel along a set path and frequent intervals, which means that additional budget and manpower has to be allocated to rendering completely new things like the ripples in the water and the reflections of light off the water. And on the topic of new objects and lighting, introducing new assets and environment interactions also introduces the need to ensure things like the lighting, shading, and shadows are consistent for these new locations. When I was researching for this video, I came across a really insightful video by Acerola on the rendering and lighting techniques used in Persona 3 Reload, and it was an incredibly comprehensive and complex process for a game that's much more linear and instance-based than open-world games like GTA, Spider-Man, and Yakuza. I'll put a link in the description to the video if anyone's interested. The point I'm trying to make with this is, even though the prospect of going to a shiny new location is definitely exciting, revisiting a familiar setting can save a ton of budget and manpower that can instead be used to meaningfully dig deeper into an already established location and make for a richer gaming experience by fleshing out the lore and the story tied to these places, which ties in nicely to the next aspect I want to cover, the narrative and how it flows across a franchise. One of the biggest narrative benefits to returning to a setting, especially in a long-running game franchise, has to be being able to leverage the immersion and emotion that the players went through in their previous games to build a sense of continuity, growth, and nostalgia. Having references and Easter eggs to events that happened in previous games have much more emotional weight in video games because the player was more personally involved in the events and conflicts of the previous game than, say, a prequel movie. And to kind of highlight this point, I want to look at how it's done in the Assassin's Creed franchise and compare it to how it's done in the Spider-Man games and the Yakuza franchise. In the early Assassin's Creed games, the overarching story follows Desmond and his journey of learning about his assassin ancestors and their relationship with the Templars. Because of this premise, the location of each game kind of becomes secondary to the present conflict between Desmond and the Templars. Instead, the setting is simply a means for Desmond to experience the memories of his ancestors and essentially backdrops for the overarching story. But because Desmond is experiencing things that have already happened, there's no sense of long-term change and evolution in the setting and the people within it. Instead, the development of the franchise is solely focused on Desmond and his role within this larger conflict between the Assassins and the Templars. The events of the historical settings feel more like moments of insight and revelation for Desmond to grow as a character, but I feel like the key area that it lacks in is it doesn't present a personal trial or some kind of conflict that Desmond himself has to overcome to grow as a character. Because of this, the historical setting doesn't feel nearly as present in Desmond's development as in other games. In contrast, I think the protagonists of the Spider-Man and Yakuza games have a much more intimate and almost symbiotic relationship with their setting. I think the growth in the protagonists are mirrored in the change in the setting and the people that inhabit it. When I was playing the Miles Morales game, the J. Jonah Jameson shows would constantly clue me in to the damage caused by the first game, and as we play as Miles, we get to see the feast shelter and the city communities recover from Mr. Negative's scheme. We see Real Morales taking a step to run for mayor after the death of her husband. Because of this, the changes in the setting and the people within it compel Miles to go through his own personal development of balancing his responsibilities and duties as a superhero with the normalcy that a son and a member of these communities have to go through. For the Yakuza games, the city of Kamurocho evolves alongside Kiryu the protagonist because the underworld crime landscape is continually changing between each game. The effects of the Millennium Tower explosion in Yakuza Kiwami are felt and come to influence important characters that appear at least 3 games later in the franchise. New crime syndicates spring up following the power vacuums left by the defeat of the antagonists of the previous games, and the balance between law enforcement and crime syndicates is constantly shifting between each game. Because of these changes in the setting between each game, Kiryu has to come to terms with the fact that his romanticized Yakuza ideals of self-sacrifice, duty to one's clan, and protection of the weak is becoming increasingly rare in a criminal underworld filled with cunning, greedy, and power-hungry people. And he also has to realize and confront the fact that his ideals are often putting those he cares about the most at risk. And so, as the series progresses and the setting evolves outside of Kiryu, Kiryu's worldview and philosophy has to change as well. He has to change from a stoic and fiercely loyal young man to a more disillusioned older man who is now adopting his own code of kindness and integrity and resolve. Because of this, I think returning to a setting for the next entry in our game franchise is a very strategic narrative decision because then, the setting feels like it's this living, breathing entity that develops and grows independently of the protagonist. It creates this continuity in the game world that makes the setting a much more present factor in the later stories, which then makes for a more dynamic, immersive, and compelling narrative experience. And for the final aspect I want to cover, there's definitely an element of metagaming when games choose to revisit a location in their games. I've already discussed before that games can leverage the immersion in the setting from previous games to bring that to their newer titles, but the opposite is also true. Even though I said that Assassin's Creed's historical settings aren't nearly as present to the main character's development as in other games, what they sacrifice in continuity between each game, they make up for in accessibility. A new player to the Yakuza franchise or the Spider-Man games will find it a little daunting that they will have to go through or entirely skip several games worth of lore, relationships, and dynamics. In that sense, the storytelling benefits to returning to a location becomes a limitation to accessibility. But for someone new to Assassin's Creed, they can realistically jump into the franchise at any point because there's a much lower barrier to entry to understanding how things work story-wise. This could have major implications for how mainstream a game becomes and how well it performs in terms of sales. I think that's why the Yakuza franchise has been doing things like introducing a new protagonist for the franchise's story to follow, making sure the games are set in places like Hawaii that are much further away from Tokyo and Kamurocho, and making sure that the game is turn-based so that people don't have to be familiar with how people used to play the games in previous titles. And the results show, because the first mainline game with a new protagonist, Yakuza Like a Dragon, is often a recommended starting point for newer players. To kind of wrap things up, it's no secret that the setting is an important part of our experience with games, and returning to a location or taking the franchise elsewhere works and has shown success in both cases. There's clear design and budget reasons for doing either, there's storytelling benefits to returning to a setting, and there's benefits to letting new players jump into the franchise when you take the setting somewhere else. But at the end of the day, what we should ask ourselves as we're playing through these game franchises is whether these choices were meaningful to us. Was I just as immersed returning to this place, or did it feel fatiguing? Did they improve or evolve certain mechanics by choosing not to make a completely new region? Is this new setting executed as well as the previous settings, or is this specific choice of location not really relevant to my overall experience with the new game? As long as we are conscious of these questions, it'll be a lot easier to evaluate as a whole how these game franchises have changed over time. Thank you for watching. I hope this video was helpful. Consider leaving a like and a subscribe, or let me know what I could change and improve about my videos. Let me know what you think about staying in the same place or going to a new location in game franchises, and I'll see you all next time.